How many of you are doing home buyer activities? Okay, or PJs are funding it, right? Most of the time, do you get the entire cost of the project from the PJ? If you're going to spend $150,000 to build the house, you're getting all of that from the PJ? No? Okay. Let's pretend you are, just from a starting point. So when we have a project, right, how much does a house cost in Minnesota? Just typical modest starter home. 170 to 200? Okay. So in order to get a house that's worth 170, how much did you spend to produce it?
The cost to build it?
To acquire the land, to build the house, to pay you a developer fee? Just rough numbers. Nobody's going to hold you to it.
Say 100,000.
You build it for 100, but it's worth 170?
I just threw out a number.
Okay. Let's say 200. Does that sound plausible to people? So we spend $200,000, but it's only worth 170? Are any of your markets like that? Okay, it's pretty common actually across the country. So we may have a project that cost $200,000, but when we're done, it's only worth 170. So the first thing we have is there's a tranche of that project that we call the development subsidy, the cost over the value, right? Let's assume that we funded all $200,000 with home. I can write off, as the PJ, I can write off that $30,000 development subsidy. It's the cost of a failed market, right? In one sense. The low-income buyers that you're working with, they don't have to be first-time buyers, but overwhelmingly they are. How much can they afford? Just your typical buyer. Not 170. 140? 140, 150? Okay? So we'll use 150. It's easier for me to do the math. They can afford 150. They can't afford the 170. So they need some direct home buyer assistance, because most of us are using recapture. If I've funded the entire project with home funds, then some of those home funds go towards the development subsidy. They've been invested and they're never coming back. Some of that home investment, this direct buyer assistance, I don't have to send a check to closing, do I? It's already invested in the property. So at closing, that assistance passes through to the buyer. On the closing statement, there's going to be a credit to the buyer for that $20,000 second mortgage and a debit against you as the seller for that $20,000 second mortgage so that it washes. Sound familiar? That's what we talk about as the development assistance that passes through to the buyer. And then the buyer's funds, their cash and their mortgage, that's what's available now. If we've funded this all with home and there's nobody else to pay off, that's what's available either as program income back to the PJ or as CHDO proceeds like we talked about a little bit earlier. Make sense? Now, once in a while, some of you don't get all $200,000 from the PJ. The PJ says, oh, I'm going to do this thing called underwriting, right? And the key point in underwriting a home buyer project is projecting how much our buyer can afford. This is what drives the economics of the deal. So as a PJ, I said, I don't need to give you $200,000. You need 30 and you need 20. You need $50,000 of home that's going to go into the project and not come back. So for $200,000, I can either do one unit or I can say to you, I'll give you 50 and I want 4 units, right? So you go to the bank and get a construction loan, or you go to LISC and get a construction loan, right? Or you go to one of the other intermediaries that sometimes you work with and get a construction loan for that $150,000. I'm oversimplifying because you should never go right up to the limit, right? In that case, some of the development costs came from home, some of the development costs came from other money. But the amount that you want to take from other money should not exceed the purchasing power of the buyer. Once in a while, that's going to happen, though, right? We underwrote, everything looked good. Turns out my buyer can't afford 150. They can only afford 140. So now I only had enough built in to pass through $20,000 of assistance to them. But they need 10 more at closing, right? So that's where this additional assistance at closing comes in. And that's also where this 10% limit that Jennifer mentioned a few minutes ago comes in. So if I have to send money to the closing that is only being used as direct assistance, it did not first get invested in the development of the property. It's not that I can't send them the $10,000 more that they need. I can send it to them. But because I only put 50 into the upfront development, at most I can charge $5,000 more to the CHDO set-aside. So they need 10 more. To send them 10 more, I have to take 5,000 of that from the entitlement portion of my grant. Does that make sense? In thinking through what that 10% limit that we talked about, it's really one of the most confusing things in the new rule to try to explain how that works. So the buyer may need $10,000 more than what I initially projected, and so I'm sending that. But I can't charge all of that to the CHDO set-aside. Some of it's going to come from the EN portion of my grant. The limit on how much I give them is driven, there's no per se limit on how much direct assistance they get, right? So it's not saying the most they can get is 10%. The limit is driven by the PJ's policies and procedures about underwriting the buyer, which Jennifer's going to talk more about in a minute. So there are some limits because we have to size their assistance to their individual need. But when we think about how this works, we're looking at primarily in the CHDO set-aside, the bulk of the funds need to be invested at this point in the upfront development, knowing that some of them will go away and never come back as development subsidy, and some of them will be transferred to the buyer as direct assistance. Okay? Does that make sense?